At Starbound, we tell stories the human way, not with artificial voices or AI slop. In the end, what's HFY without humanity? Subscribe to keep it this way. My name's General G. Let's begin. Professor Adix stood in front of the classroom, his blue-feathered yet non-avian features making him stand out against the black screen behind him. His gaze scanned the classroom before beginning, paying special attention to the front row, where the usual students were sitting: 3 furlar, 2 crivet, and a single human. He cleared his throat with a distinctive clicking sound that resonated from deep within his chest cavity, a biological quirk of his species that always preceded important announcements. His tongue, thin and forked at the tip, darted out to moisten his lips, spreading a translucent film across them that would keep them from drying during the lecture. The neural implant at the base of his skull activated, establishing connection with the classroom's video system. The familiar tingle of synaptic handshake spread across his cranium. He found himself already speaking before even checking if the screen was active, his voice firm and clear. "Today's subject," he began, his hands clasped behind his back in what he hoped was a professional stance, "is one of the more sobering topics in galactic history: the extinction of sapient species and its lasting impact on our civilization." He paused, his feathered chest flattening against his head in an unconscious display of discomfort. "I must confess, this particular subject has never been a favorite of mine. The weight of it, the implications, the sheer tragedy of intelligent life snuffed out entirely from the universe. It's deeply troubling. However, the academic curriculum demands we address this reality, examine it, learn from it. So I will do my best to teach you what you need to know, approaching it with the gravity and respect it deserves." The image on the screen behind him changed, displaying the title slide of his presentation. Professor Adix finally glanced back to confirm it was working, then turned to face his students once more. "We'll begin with the story of the most recently extinct sapient species, the Shapers." His voice dropped a little bit, taking on a more somber tone. His eyes moved to the human student in the front row, Ray, a young man with dark hair and curious eyes, who'd been one of his more attentive students this semester. "I want to address this subject with the appropriate care and sensitivity, particularly given the composition of our class." He swallowed hard, his throat clicking again. Around him, he could sense the room growing tense, students shifting in their seats. It felt as though time itself had frozen, every pair of eyes locked on him. "It is believed by many historians," he continued carefully, measuring each word, "that humanity hunted the Shapers down to the last individual, a complete and total extermination of their species." He swallowed again, harder this time, feeling the sheer weight of those words settle over the classroom like a heavy blanket. "However, I must stress, and I cannot stress this enough, that the truth remains unknown. This is educated speculation, theory based on circumstantial evidence and the timeline of events. We do not have definitive proof of what ultimately caused the Shapers' extinction. We must approach this topic with appropriate academic skepticism and avoid drawing conclusions that outpace our evidence." The reaction was immediate and visceral. The 3 furlar in the front row, Kessa with her russet-colored hide, Torm with his mottled gray and brown coat, and young Plix, whose fur was an unusual shade of amber, all turned their elongated snouts toward Ray in perfect synchrony, as if choreographed. The 2 Crivet students, Sarith and Vrex, also turned their scaled heads toward Ray, though their reptilian features made their emotions harder to read. But it was the students in the back rows who provided the most dramatic response. Unlike the furlar and crivet, who were themselves predator species, albeit far less formidable than humans in terms of hunting prowess, the prey species students had an entirely different reaction to the implication that they shared a classroom with someone whose ancestors might have committed genocide. A Plenix student, her rabbit-like features dominated by enormous eyes, actually stood up and physically pushed her desk backward with a scraping sound that made everyone wince. The movement triggered a cascade effect. Two Herbidar students, their deer-like bodies built for flight rather than fight, also shifted their desks, the furniture scraping across the floor in a cacophony of anxiety. Professor Adix felt his crest rise in alarm, his feathers fluffing out in response to the sudden tension. This was precisely the kind of scene he had wanted to avoid. This was why he had agonized over how to introduce this topic, why he had spent the previous evening rehearsing his words, trying to find the perfect balance between honesty and sensitivity to his diverse classroom. And now, despite all his preparation, he was staring at exactly what he had feared. Ray, the human student, sitting in isolation in the front row, separated from his classmates by invisible walls of suspicion and fear, his face flushing in a mixture of embarrassment and what looked like hurt. "The professor mentioned," Ray said, his words weak, "that it was all speculation, theory, not proven fact." His eyes swept across the classroom, meeting the gazes of his fellow students one by one. "Y'all heard him say that, right? That we don't actually know what happened?" From the back of the room, a Herbidar student named Quillen spoke up, his voice trembling. I've heard stories, though. Memory shares from elders in my community. They say the humans did hunt the Shapers to extinction." His ears flattened nervously. "The Shapers could mimic any species, infiltrate anywhere. They were dangerous, yes, they were impersonators, identity thieves who could steal your very appearance and use it against you. But extinction?" He swallowed hard. That's terrifying." "That's not fair," Ray started to protest, but Quillen continued. "I'm not saying humans are bad," Quillen added quickly, though his body language suggested otherwise, his desk now a full meter and a half from its original position. "I'm just saying it makes them scary, really scary." Professor Adix felt control of his classroom slipping away like water through his fingers. "Order!" he called out, his voice sharp. The feathers on his crest stood fully erect now, a display of dominance that was instinctive to his species when asserting control. "I will not allow disrespect in my classroom, much less disrespect based on speculation and rumors about centuries-old history. We are scholars here, or we are meant to be. We deal in evidence, in verifiable facts, not in fear-mongering and prejudice." But one of the Plenix students, a young female named Sora, raised her hand tentatively, her ears quivering. When Professor Adix nodded to her in reluctance, she spoke in a quiet voice. "But Professor, the humans were at war with the Shapers. That's documented fact, not speculation. And while we can't be absolutely certain about the complete extinction, maybe there's a handful of Shapers left somewhere in deep space. We know for certain that humanity killed a lot of them, thousands, maybe millions." She paused, gathering courage. "You're always telling us that part of academic integrity is studying the past, however ugly it may be. How can we learn from history if we're too uncomfortable to examine it honestly?" The silence that followed spread through the classroom like a virus, infecting every corner, every student. Professor Adix felt it settling over him as well, heavy and suffocating. He realized with growing dismay that he had been put in an impossible position. If he defended Ray too vigorously, he would appear to be minimizing legitimate historical concerns. If he allowed the discussion to continue unchecked, he would be permitting discrimination against a student based on their species. His mind raced, trying to formulate a response that would thread this impossible needle, that would restore order and learning to his classroom while protecting Ray from persecution and educating his other students about the dangers of prejudice. He opened his mouth, not entirely sure what words would come out, when suddenly Ray stood up. The movement was quick, explosive, and it startled nearly everyone in the room. Professor Adix felt his own heart rate spike, a rush of adrenaline flooding his system. For one terrible moment, he feared violence. Imagined Ray lashing out in anger or frustration. Imagined having to activate the emergency protocols. Imagined the scandal that would follow. But Ray didn't move toward anyone. He didn't raise his fists or his voice to a shout. Instead, he reached into his pocket slowly, clearly aware that everyone was watching him with varying degrees of alarm. "Look," Ray said, his voice steady now, calmer than Professor Adix would have expected given the circumstances. "I'll be honest with you all. I was never a particularly good student before I joined the Galactic University. My grades were mediocre, my study habits were worse, and I didn't really care much about academic achievement." He pulled a datapad from his pocket, holding it up for everyone to see. "But I've been trying to do better here. I've been trying to learn, to engage, to be part of this community. And right now, I can see that you all are very interested in what happened to the Shapers." He paused, looking around the room again, his gaze lingering on the students who had pushed their desks away from him. "So here's what I'm going to do," Ray continued. "I'm going to ask my grandpa, right now, through the FTL network." Professor Adix blinked in confusion, his feathered chest flattening in bewilderment. "Your grandpa?" Ray was already activating his datapad, his fingers quickly interacting with the interface. "Yeah, my grandpa. He fought in the war against the Shapers. He was actually there, on the front lines. If anyone knows what really happened to them, it would be him, right?" The shock that rippled through the classroom was clear. Students who had been whispering fell silent. Those who had been avoiding looking at Ray now simply stared at him. Kessa found her voice first. "Your grandfather fought in the Shaper War? That was nearly 100 years ago." 93 years to be precise, Ray said, not looking up from his datapad. "Humans can live a long time with modern medical care. Grandpa's 120 now, but he's still sharp as a tack." He looked up at Professor Adix. "Permission to connect to the class main screen. I think everyone should hear this directly from someone who was there." Professor Adix stood frozen, his mind trying to process what was happening. This was new, irregular, completely outside the bounds of normal classroom procedure. He should say no. He should take back control of the situation, dismiss the class early, report the disruption to the dean. But another part of him, the part that had become a teacher because he genuinely wanted to help students learn, the part that valued truth over comfort, recognized that this might be exactly what was needed. A primary source, an eyewitness to history. Not speculation or theory or second-hand accounts passed down through generations, but actual testimony from someone who had been there. He let out a long, weary sigh, feeling suddenly much older than his 73 years. The situation couldn't possibly get any worse, he told himself. Might as well see it through. "Oh, very well," he said, disconnecting his neural implant from the screen system. "You have my permission. Connect to the main screen." Ray's fingers worked fast, entering commands, routing signals through the university's FTL communication array. These arrays were phenomenally expensive to use, which was why students were strictly limited in their access to them, usually reserved for emergencies or pre-approved research projects. But Ray didn't seem concerned about the cost as he initiated the transmission. The classroom's main screen flickered, showing the standard connection establishing graphic with its rotating symbols representing the major species of the Galactic Council. Then, after a moment that felt much longer than it actually was, the screen resolved to an image that made Professor Adix question whether this was actually happening, or if he had somehow fallen asleep at his desk and was experiencing a very bizarre dream. On the screen was a very old human man, ancient by any standard, with skin weathered and creased by more than a century of life. But what caught everyone's attention was his appearance. He wore what Professor Adix vaguely recognized as historical human attire from Earth's western regions. A wide-brimmed hat they called a cowboy hat, and he had a truly magnificent mustache, long and white, that drooped down past his chin on either side. The old man's eyes narrowed as he took in the sight of his grandson on what was clearly a video call, surrounded by alien faces in what was obviously a classroom setting. "Ray," the old man said, his voice gravelly and thick with an accent that Professor Adix couldn't quite place. "Got some nerve, boy, some real nerve." He leaned closer to his screen, his mustache bristling. "It's been a whole year since you last called your old grandpa, a full year. And now, when you finally decide to grace me with your presence, you put me on a video call with an entire alien classroom?" He sat back, crossing his arms over his chest. "Did your mother not teach you any manners? Were you raised by wild animals?" Ray had the grace to look sheepish, his earlier confidence deflating. "It hasn't been a full year, Grandpa. I called you on your birthday, remember? That was 11 months ago, but still, not quite a year." "Oh, well, 11 months." The old man's voice dripped with sarcasm. "That's so much better. I stand corrected. Clearly I was being unreasonable." He leaned forward again, his eyes shrewd beneath bushy white eyebrows. "Let me guess, you need money." "What? No, Grandpa, I don't need money. I suddenly felt like calling you, to talk, to catch up." The old man stared at his grandson for a long, silent moment. Then he said flatly, "You need money." "I don't need money." "Then why are you calling me in front of a classroom full of aliens? Is this some kind of bet? Did you bet with your alien friends that your old grandpa was a war veteran, and now you need me to prove it so you can collect?" The old man's mustache twitched in irritation. "Because that's just another way of using me to make money, boy, and I won't have it." Ray pinched the bridge of his nose, a gesture that transcended species barriers in its universal expression of exasperation. "Grandpa, no. Look, we were having a discussion in class about the Shapers." "Oh, the Shapers!" The old man's entire demeanor changed, his eyebrows shooting up toward his hairline. "And it became kind of controversial. Some of the other students are afraid of me now because they believe humanity caused the extinction of the Shapers. But we didn't hunt them all down, right? I mean, their extinction was indirect, wasn't it? Something else must have caused the final decline of their population, right?" The old man stared at the screen, his eyes moving from his grandson to take in the entire classroom. Professor Adix found himself being examined by those sharp, ancient eyes, assessed and catalogued in a way that made him distinctly uncomfortable. The gaze moved across each student, lingering on the furlar, the crivet, the prey species students in the back who had moved their desks. Then the old man burst out laughing. It wasn't a polite chuckle or a modest laugh. It was a full-throated, belly-deep guffaw that shook the old man's entire frame. He laughed so hard that he had to remove his hat to wipe tears from his eyes. He laughed until he was wheezing, struggling to catch his breath. The classroom sat in uncomfortable silence, watching this display with confusion and obvious concern. Professor Adix felt his feathers flatten against his skull in bewilderment. What could possibly be so funny about genocide, about extinction, about the fear and tension that had gripped this classroom? Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the old man's laughter subsided into occasional chuckles. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and replaced his hat on his head. "Oh boy," he said, still grinning widely. "Oh, Ray, you have no idea how pathetic this is. The sheer poetry of you calling me, today, to talk about this exact subject." His grin faded slightly, replaced by something more serious, almost conspiratorial. "But I'm going to warn you right now. Your mother is not going to like that we're talking about this, not one bit." Professor Adix felt confusion crystallize into concern. What did Ray's mother have to do with the extinction of the Shapers? But no, that couldn't be possible. He found himself speaking before he had fully thought through the implications of interrupting. "Excuse me," Professor Adix said, his voice formal and perhaps a bit strained. "Sir, I'm Professor Adix, the instructor of this class. What exactly is going on here? Why would Ray's mother object to discussing historical events?" The old man's eyes focused on Professor Adix with an intensity that made the professor want to take a step backward. Then the old man looked back at his grandson. Ray mirrored the question, his own confusion evident. "Yeah, Grandpa, I'm not following. What does Mom have to do with the Shapers? She wasn't even born yet when the war happened." The old man sighed deeply. The sound strange in the current situation. He removed his hat again, this time holding it in his hands, turning it slowly as if gathering his thoughts. "All right," he said finally. "All right. I suppose it's time this came out. Past time, really." He looked directly at the camera, addressing the entire classroom now. "The history that the galaxy knows, the official version, the one you all learn in school, is mostly about the war humanity fought against the Shapers. The battles, the strategies, the casualties on both sides. What the galactic history books don't tell you is what happened after the war ended. And that omission was very much by choice of the Galactic Council at the time." Professor Adix felt his heart rate increase. This was it. This was where they would learn about the systematic extermination, the hunting parties, the genocide. He braced himself mentally, preparing to hear the worst, the confirmation of every horrible rumor, every dark speculation. But the story the old man told took an entirely different turn. "After the war," the old man continued, "the Shaper refugees became a huge problem for the galaxy. Not because they were violent. By that point, they were defeated, broken, scared. The problem was that they could infiltrate anywhere. Their natural abilities allowed them to steal DNA from any species and mimic them perfectly. They could be anyone, anywhere, at any time. Trust, which is the foundation of any civilization, became impossible in regions where Shapers were present, and the tech to detect them was not available." He paused, letting his words sink in. Several students nodded, understanding the dilemma. "The Galactic Council held emergency sessions. They debated for months about what to do, and eventually a majority voted to eliminate the Shaper species entirely. Complete extermination. They saw no other way to restore stability and trust to the galaxy." Professor Adix felt his blood run cold. So it was true after all. The genocide had happened, and humanity— "But humanity," the old man said, his voice growing stronger, "the species that had just won the war, the species that had lost millions of soldiers fighting the Shapers, humanity voted against it." The classroom erupted in whispers. Professor Adix raised a hand for silence, but even he was leaning forward now, desperate to hear more. "We didn't just vote against it," the old man continued. "We threatened to leave the Galactic Council entirely if they went through with it. We said we hadn't fought a war to save the galaxy, just to turn around and commit genocide. That wasn't who we were. That wasn't who we wanted to be." "But what happened?" Sora asked, unable to contain herself. Several other students echoed the question, voices overlapping in eagerness. The old man's weathered face broke into a slight smile. "What happened is that humanity offered the Shapers refuge. On Earth, we offered them a home, protection, a chance to rebuild their society. But there were conditions, strict conditions. They could never try to infiltrate or take over our government. They could never use their abilities for deception or harm. They had to live openly, honestly, as part of our society." The entire class erupted now, students talking over each other, questions flying. How was this possible? Why didn't anyone know? How could this have worked? Even Ray looked shocked, his mouth hanging open in disbelief. Professor Adix had to physically step between rows of desks, his voice rising to a volume he rarely used. "Quiet! Silence!" The authority in his voice finally broke through the chaos. He turned back to the screen, his mind reeling. "Sir, with all respect, this cannot possibly have worked. The Shapers have had a natural tendency toward infiltration and conspiracy. Their entire evolutionary history was based on mimicry and deception. How could humanity possibly integrate them into Earth society without catastrophic consequences?" The old man's smile widened, his mustache moving as he spoke. "Oh, you're absolutely right, Professor.
The Shapers do have those tendencies. They're very protective of their own, very tribal. They do naturally gravitate toward positions of influence and power. We knew all of that going in.
Then how?
We had a solution, the old man interrupted. A biological solution that the Shapers themselves proposed as a compromise.
No one in the classroom was moving now. Even the students who had pushed their desks away were leaning forward, straining to hear. The old man spoke a single word.
Hybrids.
The word hung in the air like a physical thing.
The Shapers, he continued, have a unique ability that most species don't possess. They can produce viable hybrid offspring with any other sapient species. Any species at all. And here's the key. The hybrid offspring typically don't inherit the full shape-shifting abilities. Instead, those abilities remain dormant, sometimes for generations. They only activate under extreme circumstances, severe starvation, life-threatening distress, situations where survival depends on adaptation.
Professor Adix found himself walking slowly down the aisle, getting closer to the screen, needing to see the old man's face clearly as he spoke these words that were rewriting everything he thought he knew about galactic history.
So,
Professor Adix said slowly, working through the implications.
Humanity integrated with the Shapers, and over time the Shaper DNA became diluted through the human population, with the troublesome shape-shifting traits remaining inactive in the current generation?
The old man scratched his head, dislodging his hat slightly.
Well, that's basically it, yes. Though I'd argue that troublesome is a bit harsh. The Shapers are just different, not evil. But yes, over the course of several generations, their traits will fuse with human traits, or perhaps even evolve into something new. Today, it's estimated that about 5% of Earth's human population has some Shaper ancestry.
He paused, and his gaze moved back to his grandson. When he spoke again, his voice was gentler, almost apologetic.
Of course, some of the original Shaper population is still alive. They're long-lived beings, you see. With proper medical care, they can survive for centuries.
Another pause. The old man's eyes locked onto Ray's face on his own screen.
Your grandmother, for instance, is doing remarkably well for her advanced age.
The classroom seemed to freeze. Time itself seemed to stop. Professor Adix felt his mind struggling to process what he had just heard, trying to reject it, even as the logic of it clicked into place with horrible clarity. The irony crashed over him like a wave. He had been teaching a class about extinct species. He had been describing the Shapers as gone, vanished from the galaxy, wiped out by humanity's military might. And sitting in his front row the entire time, looking more and more uncomfortable as his classmates turned against him, was a hybrid of that supposedly extinct species. Ray had gone pale, his face losing all color. His hands gripped the edge of his desk so tightly that Professor Adix could see them trembling. When he spoke, his voice was not very powerful.
So, Mom is?
The old man nodded gently.
A first-generation hybrid. Her mother, your grandmother, is a full-blooded Shaper, which makes you, my boy, a second-generation hybrid.
The shock rippled through the classroom like an earthquake. Kessa's ears shot straight up in surprise. Sareth's tongue darted out rapidly, her species equivalent of stammering. The prey species students in the back looked torn between their ingrained fear of humans and a dawning realization that perhaps their assumptions had been wrong. Ray sat completely still, his face a mask of disbelief.
But Grandma looks so young. I always thought Mom didn't speak to you because you remarried a younger woman. I thought that was why there was tension. I thought...
The old man's laughter, when it came, was softer this time, tinged with sadness.
Your mother never dealt well with her identity crisis. Learning the truth about her heritage when she was a teenager, it broke something in her. She withdrew from both sides of her family. She didn't want to be seen as Shaper or human. She just wanted to be herself. and she decided that the best way to do that was to never tell you, to let you grow up thinking you were fully human.
He shook his head slowly.
I respected her wishes for a long time, maybe too long. But your grandmother and we thought you should know eventually. We could never agree on when.
The whole classroom remained frozen in silence, every student processing this revelation in their own way. Professor Adix found his analytical mind cataloging details he had never noticed before. The way Ray's eyes were perhaps a bit too reflective in certain lights, the unusual smoothness of his skin, the way he sometimes seemed to understand other students' emotions with uncanny accuracy. Professor Adix cleared his throat, trying to restore some semblance of academic discourse to this completely unpredictable situation.
Sir, I apologize for pressing, but something still doesn't make sense. Why isn't this widely available information? Why don't the history books mention any of this? The presence of shapers on Earth, the hybrid integration program, these are massive historical facts. Why the secrecy?
The old man's expression turned somewhat cynical.
Well, that's where politics come in, Professor. You see, the old leadership of the Galactic Council, the ones who had voted for complete extermination, they were in a difficult position. They had been ready to commit genocide, and only humanity's threat to leave the Council had stopped them. That didn't look good in the history books.
He leaned back in his chair, his hat shadowing his eyes slightly.
So they made humanity a deal. Earth would receive substantial financial compensation, essentially. We'd be paid to keep quiet for 50 years, long enough for the political leaders who had voted for extermination to retire, die, or be forgotten. Long enough for the crisis to fade from public memory. After 50 years, the truth could come out, but by then, he shrugged. By then, everyone had gotten used to the official story. The version where humans killed the Shapers was simpler, cleaner. It fit people's narratives about humanity being dangerous, about the cost of war. No one wanted to do the hard work of updating textbooks and curricula.
The old man's smile turned wry.
They just preferred to go with the version that humans killed the Shapers rather than, well, you know what? Make love, don't make war.
The crude implication hung in the air. Several students looked scandalized. Kessa made a choking sound. Professor Adix felt his feathers stand on end in shock. But the old man didn't seem bothered by their reactions. He looked at his grandson again, his expression softening once more.
Ray, I expect a call later, a private call where we can talk about all this properly. You'll have questions and you deserve answers.
He gave a small wave to the classroom.
As for the rest of you, it was interesting meeting y'all, but I'm afraid it's time for my tea and my pills. The joys of being 120.
The screen flickered once and then went dark, leaving the classroom in stunned silence. Ray sat motionless, staring at the now blank screen. Then, very quietly, he said, "So I'm a hybrid." He took a deep breath, held it, and let it out slowly. "I'm a hybrid shaper." Another breath. "Well," he said, and Professor Adix could hear him trying to inject some levity into his voice despite the shock. "I guess that's still better than finding out Grandpa married someone way too young for him." He stood up slowly, gathering his datapad with shaking hands. "You know what? I think it's time to pay Grandma a visit. Have a long conversation. Ask some questions I should have asked years ago." He looked around the classroom, meeting the eyes of his fellow students one by one. "I'm sorry, Professor, but I need to excuse myself. I have too much to think about right now." Professor Adix nodded mutely, unable to find words adequate to the situation. Ray walked toward the door, his gait slightly unsteady. The classroom watched him go in complete silence. For several long moments, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Then Torm, one of the Furlar students, broke the silence. "So, humans didn't kill the Shapers, they... He struggled for the right word, his snout working as he tried to process everything. Professor Adix held up a hand quickly, cutting him off before he could complete the thought with the vulgar term that was clearly on his mind. Whatever they did, Professor Adix said firmly, his voice carrying the full authority of his position, they did not commit genocide. He looked around the classroom, making eye contact with each student who had pushed their desk away from Ray. Which means we blamed them, blamed Ray for nothing, based on incomplete information, rumors, and fear. He paused, letting that sink in. Tomorrow, when Ray returns to class, if he returns to class, every single one of you owes him an apology. A genuine, sincere apology. Is that understood? Heads nodded around the room, slowly at first, then with more conviction. Kessa looked particularly ashamed, her ears drooping. The prey species students in the back were already moving their desks back to their original positions, the scraping sound filling the silence. Professor Adix looked at the blank screen, then at his carefully prepared presentation slides that he had never even reached. He thought about all the lectures he had given over the years, all the history he had taught with such confidence. And he thought about Ray, walking through the corridors right now, his entire understanding of his own identity shattered and reformed in the space of a 10-minute conversation with his grandfather. A roller coaster, he thought. This class had been an absolute roller coaster, and in the end, not a single extinction had actually happened. The Shapers weren't extinct. They were on Earth. They were integrated into human society. They were grandmothers and parts of families. They were alive. Professor Adix sat down at his desk, his legs suddenly feeling unsteady. He looked at his students, all of them still processing what they had learned. "Class dismissed," he said quietly. "Go home. Think about what happened here today. Think about the danger of accepting official narratives without question." The students gathered their belongings slowly, speaking in hushed whispers among themselves. As they filed out, Professor Adix heard fragments of their conversations. "Can't believe we treated him like that." "Makes so much sense now, the way he always seemed to have to make this right tomorrow." When the last student had left, Professor Adix sat alone in the empty classroom. He thought about updating his curriculum. He thought about all the other extinct species in the galaxy's historical records and wondered how many of them were truly gone. But mostly, he thought about Ray and hoped the young man would be all right. Because sometimes learning the truth about yourself was the hardest lesson of all.